Hi, thank you for joining me. I want to talk today about something that affects everybody: depression, sorrow, that internal grief, that anguish of the soul that affects everybody. If you've never felt it, well, you will, because this life can be tough. This life can be hard. It is filled with things that will affect us emotionally. And Psalm 13 has something to say about that. So today I want to go over Psalm 13. It's a brief psalm. It's only 6 verses long, but it speaks powerfully to the soul. It speaks powerfully to those life circumstances that most affect us. It speaks to those times in life where we begin to ask questions of God. Where are you, God? Where have you been? Why have you been so far away? Why have you been so long away? And that's what this psalm goes into. Looking at the psalm, it's written by King David. It begins, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Consider me and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my adversaries will rejoice when I am shaken. But I have trusted in your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." Right away, we notice in this psalm questions. Questions that we would not be accustomed to asking God, or we would not feel appropriate to ask him. Like, how long? Where have you been? Now, right away, whatever it is you're feeling in your heart, you ought to be communicating this to God. If you have questions of him, why has this taken so long? Why is this circumstance extended? What is going on? Ask him just that. Communicate that with him in prayer. And so this psalm is not something to be avoided, but the question, it can be a fine question to ask because you may be wondering it, and we don't need to hide our thoughts or feelings from God because he already knows them. Notice in the verse 1 and 2, 4 times David asks, how long? Again, how long? How long? How long? David's sorrow, what is affecting him emotionally here, it's not the quick, sharp problems of life that often can spring up in a moment's notice and dissipate. This is the extended anguish of David's heart. This is an extended circumstance. They say that time flies when you're having fun, but the opposite is also true. Time can really slow down when life is not going well. It can feel like in those circumstances, it's taking forever to see the other side. So this is a prolonged circumstance that David's speaking to. David has had a lot of circumstances in his life that have been rough. And we don't know exactly which one he's referring to here. And it's not necessary for us to know to really begin to think on this psalm, to apply it to our own heart, and to learn and grow from it. He begins in the first verse, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? It feels to David as if God has forgotten David's circumstances. It feels to David as if God has really turned his face away. In fact, he says this in the next line. How long will you hide your face from me? Where is God? And David is communicating this, and not in some way that would encroach upon who God is, in a way that accuses God of something. But he's asking a genuine question. How long will this circumstance, how long will this go on before you answer, Lord? That's his question. In verse 2, how long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? What does it mean to take counsel in his soul? Well, he kind of explains it in the next line, having sorrow in my heart all the day. David is ruminating, as Spurgeon would say about this. He's ruminating on these sorrowful thoughts. They're going around in his heart, in his mind, constantly. He's chewing on it constantly. He's chewing on his sorrow constantly. He's dwelling on it often. Um, how long will he continue in this pattern before he hears an answer to his prayer from God? David again asked the question. Again, there's no answer provided. He just keeps asking the question. How long will my enemy be exalted over me? David has had many enemies in his life. He's had maybe two most notable would be King Saul, who tried to kill him for a long time, and David's own son Absalom, who took over the kingdom, who staged a coup and took over the kingdom and was chasing David down. Those are two prominent enemies in David's life. We don't know which one David is talking to here, but there are other enemies. There are the Philistines and other national foes that have come after David. How long will my enemy be exalted over me? It looks like the enemy is actually having an upper hand, is having a moment in the sun of victory over David here. Now, in our own lives, we don't necessarily have kings. Well, we don't have kings chasing us down yet. But we certainly have had enemies in our life. We have had, whether it's friends, whether it's family, who have felt very much, maybe not after our physical life, but after us nonetheless, and felt very much like enemies. And for the Christian, we definitely know we have an enemy in Satan, that he is most certainly an enemy. And it would even appear today, at the end of April, that he is in several ways triumphing over his foes. And this is the anguish of David's heart. It's prolonged, it's pronounced, and he is praying to God. And that's the first thing that I would note, that in all these questions, how long, how long, how long, how long, David is going to the right source. He's going to God himself in the right way. Prayer is a humble act. He's going humbly to God, asking these questions in a way that is humble and respectful. He's in the thick of it, and he's in prayer to God. It continues in verse 3. Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Answer me. He's now pleading with God. Answer my situation. Answer my prayer. Look to my situation and consider it. And please answer. He says, enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. Enlightening the eyes, that is that light that comes in and gives the sparkle to the eye, where you can see that the heart is glad through the eye. You can see this when somebody is famished and tired, and then they have a little bit of food. All of a sudden, their eyes they brighten. That is what David is asking for. He's asking for the light of life to again enter him, or he will sleep the sleep of death. This is poetry. This is metaphorical, but he has an enemy. So for David, this may actually be literal as well. Unless God should consider David's circumstances, David very much feels that he will sleep the sleep of death because of this prolonged, this protracted, this pronounced situation in his life. He says, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my adversaries will rejoice when I am shaken. David is saying, God, unless you should come and intervene, unless you consider these circumstances and answer me, my enemy will triumph. Now, for David, this has a different connotation than it has for anyone else in history. David's enemies are actually enemies of God to the extent that they would threaten, um, the Davidic covenant. That to the extent that they would seek to destroy the house of David, that house, that lineage through which God has promised the Messiah to come. To the extent that enemies would seek to wipe out David's house, they are in fact God's definite enemies as well. Um, Now we can't necessarily say that in our life as clearly or as defined as David might be able to hear, but we certainly do have an adversary in Satan, and his perceived exaltation and his temporary victories in this world. Um, well, they are counter to the glory of God. Uh, our enemy is God's enemy in Satan, and in this way we can understand it. One thing I would point out about 1, 2, and 3 here. This is also a picture of spiritual warfare. So it's true, this is a picture of depression. This looks like a heavy set of the blues. This looks like a great emotional agitation and anguish. This is also spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare is not what the movies make it out to be. We're not fighting against demons. We're not doing those sorts of things. Spiritual warfare is the battle for the truth. And here, in the mind and the heart of David, the battle for the truth is raging. In effect, emotional circumstances, negative emotional circumstances, depression, are those opportune times when our spiritual adversary or our enemy will come and seek to wage war against the truth that we know. For example, consider what we just went through, verses 1 through 4, and David's question, where are you, God? It's been so long. But David knows truth. Look at Psalm 139. In verse 7, this is David writing again. Verse 7, where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take to the wings of dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be as night, even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as day. Darkness and light are alike to you. David is asking these questions. He's questioning. But he also knows the truth about who God is, that even in the darkest of times where we can't see anything, when the storms of life have so clouded and obscured the sunlight, David does know that his God, our God, can see. Darkness is not dark to God. He is not blinded. His vision is not obscured. David knows this truth, but his emotions and what he feels are greatly affecting him. And certainly there's spiritual warfare in this. Will David succumb to his emotions and begin into that spiral descent of depression where he is now taking action upon those negative feelings? Or will he remember who God is? Remember the attack of Satan against Eve, this spiritual warfare, this spiritual attack against Eve in the garden, where Satan asked the question, God did not say. He's attacking the very nature and character and the word of God, the truth about who God is, what God has said. This is spiritual warfare, and David here is in the thick of it. When we are in great agony of the soul, when we are depressed, yes, Christians can be depressed. That is an opportune time for our enemy to sneak in those questions, to cause us to doubt what we knew, what we know about who God is. David knows this about God. He knows all this about God. But in his circumstance, the emotions are real and they're felt. So David has a choice. And we see his decision. But it's one of the greatest words. It's one of the greatest words in Scripture. But in spite of all this, David is resisting the temptations of the adversary to go contrary to what he knows to be true of God, even though David is in a dark place and he may not be able to see the light of his circumstances. But I have trusted in your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I want to point out a few elements of this. David is trusting. Trust is an element of our faith. In your loving kindness, this is related to God's grace, in which He intervenes in ways that only He can, to produce only results that He can in the lives of His people for His express circumstances. His loving kindness that is steadfast. This is related to our New Testament concepts of what we know God to be. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. Brother, sister, friend, if you are in the thick of it and you are fighting the lies of the enemy and there is very little light, remember your faith. Remember God's grace and His loving kindness, and remember the joy of your salvation. If all else seems dark, hold on to that which you know is most certain about God, because the dark is not darkness to Him. David continues, I will sing to the Lord. Whoa, we have all this in verse 1 through 4, and in verse 6, the turnaround, I will sing to the Lord. What's going on? Has David's circumstances changed? No, they haven't changed. All this is true. All this is true. 1 through 4. In this blank space between verse 4 and 5, there was not some great change in David's circumstances. What changed was David's emotions came under, I've heard it said like this, David's emotions came under the jurisdiction of what he knew to be true about God. David's emotions did not rule his thoughts and his actions. What David knew to be true about God, his faith in God, is what ruled the day, even in the circumstances, even when they didn't change for David right away. And David says, I will sing to the Lord because He has dealt bountifully with me. Really? Has God dealt bountifully with David? Has God been good to David? Consider all this. 1 through 4. All this is still true. It's prolonged. It's pronounced. It's painful. All that is still true. But God has dealt bountifully with David. How can this be? Because David remembers his faith and his trust in who God is and what He has done in His salvation. And friend, pilgrim, if you're in the thick of it now, if those clouds are obscuring the sun, well, the sun is still there, even though there's clouds obscuring it. Even though our vision has been narrowed or darkened, and we do not sense God anywhere near for a long time, that does not change who He is. we must remind ourselves of our salvation, of our God, of his love for us, and that yes, even he can bring about the worst of experiences, the worst of pain, for our good and for his glory. I'm reminded of one of the martyrs in early church history. He said, when he was being burned at the stake, 84 years I've served my Lord, and he has done me no wrong. For 84 years, this man had known and walked with God, with Jesus. And even though now he's about to be burned at the stake, even though throughout his life he'd experienced much persecution, he found no fault in the way that Jesus had dealt with him. How could he deny him now? Christian, our God has done us no wrong. We deserve, what we earned was his wrath. Every painful circumstance, even death, is something that we deserve. But God, being gracious, did a work that only he can do, produced the results that only he could do, in that he sent Jesus Christ to die for you, to die for me, to take the penalty of the wrath of God on himself, the full length of it, and to give us his righteousness. No longer are we clothed in the dirtiness of our filthy deeds. Christ has taken that upon himself, been punished for that, and instead given us his perfect, clean clothing. And God sees us in that light. Remember that. He has dealt bountifully with you. This is why Paul and Silas can sing in prison, sing hymns though they're in prison. This is why the testimony of the saints throughout history, Old Testament, New Testament, church history, today, can glorify and praise God though they are greatly afflicted with bodily injury, with sickness, with debilitating things, with persecution. And yet praise God because he's been so good. And if all you can think of right now in the midst of your turmoil is the truth about your salvation, hang on to it. Do not let it go. For indeed, he has dealt bountifully with you. And though it is dark, darkness is as light to our great God. I hope this was helpful. I hope this was encouraging. And if you're in the midst of spiritual battle, remember the truth of who God is. Until next time, grace and peace and blessings from God.